This 1870 portrait of a mother and her son looks gentle at first, until you notice the boy's hair. At first glance, it seems like a beautiful image. A woman in silk, a child leaning into her shoulder, and a soft, blurry studio background behind them. It looks like love. It had looked like love for over 150 years, until one archivist couldn't stop staring at the top of the boy's head. Eleanor Vance had been cataloguing photographs at a historical society in Richmond for 11 years. She had handled thousands of images from the antebellum and Reconstruction periods, everything from daguerreotype portraits of Confederate officers to cabinet cards of newly freed families standing proud outside their first-owned homes. She knew what to expect from photographs of this time. She understood the poses, the props, and the careful staging meant to show status and respectability. But the image she took from a donated estate collection in the spring of 2019 made her pause in a way nothing had in years. The photograph was a cabinet card, roughly 4x6, mounted on thick cardstock with the photographer's name embossed in gold along the bottom. The woman in the portrait looked to be in her early 30s, wearing a dark silk dress with jet buttons running from her collar to her waist. Her hair was parted in the middle and pulled back in a style typical of the early 1870s. She sat in a carved wooden chair, her left arm around a young boy who stood beside her, leaning into her. The boy appeared to be 6 or 7 years old. His clothes were fine, a little velvet suit with a white lace collar, the kind of outfit a wealthy family might dress their child in for a special occasion. His skin was brown. His features suggested African ancestry, and his head leaned slightly toward the woman's shoulder, at first seeming like a natural sign of affection. Eleanor had seen photographs like this before. Mixed-race families existed throughout American history, even when laws and customs forbade acknowledging them openly. She thought this might be one of those images, quietly documenting a relationship that couldn't be spoken about at the time. But something about the boy's hair kept drawing her attention. It was straight, not wavy or loosely curled, which might occur naturally in a child of mixed heritage. Straight, flat, almost plastered to his scalp in a way that looked uncomfortable, and along the hairline just above his left ear, Eleanor noticed a faint discoloration, maybe a chemical burn or something worse. She leaned closer, adjusting her magnifying lamp, and felt her stomach tighten. The hair didn't look natural. It looked like it had been forced. Eleanor had spent over a decade learning to read photographs the way other people read books. She knew that every part of a 19th century studio portrait was intentional. The backdrops, the props, the positions of hands and bodies, all staged to show something specific. Wealth, piety, family harmony, respectability. Nothing was accidental. So when a detail didn't fit, it usually meant there was a story the photograph wasn't telling. She had seen photographs where the hidden detail was a set of manacles behind a chair leg. She had seen portraits where a servant positioned behind a white family revealed a hidden iron collar on closer inspection. She had learned to notice what didn't belong, the objects and poses that disrupted the careful performance of normal life. But she had never seen anything like this boy's hair. She removed the cabinet card from its sleeve and turned it over. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written a name and a date, Adelaide Marsh with son, 1870. Below that, in different handwriting, was a partially erased word, still legible when held at the right angle. The word was Samuel, 2 names, mother and son, according to the note. But the erasure suggested that someone had wanted to erase the claim this photograph made about their relationship. Eleanor set the card down and stared at it. She had a feeling, one she had learned to trust, that this was not just a portrait of a mother and child. This was evidence of something else, and if she didn't follow it, the truth might remain hidden. The photographer's stamp read Whitmore and Company, Richmond. Eleanor started there, pulling city directories from the 1860s and 1870s to trace the studio's history. She found it listed on Broad Street from 1858 to 1879, run by Thomas Whitmore, who advertised portraits of distinction for families of quality. The wording was typical of the time, signaling that the studio catered to wealthy white clients. But a deeper search of Whitmore's business records, donated to a university archive in the 1990s, revealed something more. Whitmore kept a separate ledger for what he called special commissions. These were portraits for clients who didn't want their names in the main book. The entries were sparse, just initials, dates, and occasional payment notes. But one entry from March 1870 caught Eleanor's eye. Am portrait with Ward. Hair preparation required. Extra fee. Ward, not son, and hair preparation. Eleanor began to piece things together, though the picture was unsettling. She contacted a colleague at a university in Washington, Dr. Lorraine Okonkwo, a historian specializing in the post-emancipation period and the ways white families maintained control over black children after slavery. Dr. Okonkwo had spent years documenting the practice of apprenticing black children to their former enslavers, keeping minors as unpaid labor under the guise of care. She had also written about companion children, black children kept in white households not for work but for companionship, dressed in fine clothes, shown as evidence of the family's generosity. When Eleanor sent a high-resolution scan, Dr. Okonkwo replied within hours, "I've seen images like this before. The clothing, the pose, the proximity to the white woman, it all fits the pattern. But the hair is unusual. Most companion children were photographed with their natural hair, often styled to show their difference from white family members. Straightening it like this would have been painful and rare. It suggests the family wanted to hide his race, to make him look more like a biological child. That is a different kind of violence than exploitation. It is erasure." Eleanor searched for more about Adelaide Marsh. The name appeared in Richmond city directories from 1865 to 1882 at a prominent address in Church Hill. Census records from 1870 listed Adelaide Marsh, age 32, head of household, her widowed mother, Margaret Marsh, age 58, and one black female servant, Celia, age 45. No child was listed. This was not unusual for the period. Black children in white households were often left out of official records or described in ways that hid their true status. But the absence of a child in the same year as the photograph raised questions. If Samuel was Adelaide's son, legally or otherwise, why wasn't he counted among the household members? And if he wasn't her son, then what exactly was he? Eleanor dug further into the Marsh family history. She discovered that Adelaide's husband, Walter Marsh, a cotton merchant, had died in 1864 during the final year of the Civil War. His will, filed with the Richmond Probate Court, made provisions for his wife and explicitly mentioned all the servants and their children who were part of the estate. The Marshes had been enslavers, and according to the will, those enslaved people were not freed when Walter died, but instead transferred to Adelaide's ownership. Among the names listed in an inventory attached to the will was a woman named Celia, age 39 at the time, and her daughter, whose name was not recorded, age 4. There was no mention of a son. But 4 years later, the census showed Celia still in the household at age 45, with no daughter listed, and the photograph showed a boy of about 6 or 7, dressed in velvet, leaning into Adelaide Marsh's shoulder as if she were his mother. Eleanor contacted Dr. Okonkwo again with her findings. The historian's response was careful but grim. "This fits a pattern I've seen in many cases. After emancipation, some white families kept black children, even when the adults in their households left or were forced out. The children were young enough to be controlled. In some situations, the white family would claim legal guardianship through the apprenticeship system. But the most troubling cases are the ones without any legal record at all. The white family just kept the child, sometimes calling them orphans, sometimes presenting them as adopted, and sometimes, as this photograph suggests, trying to pass them off as their biological children. The hair straightening would fit that last pattern. It was an attempt to hide the child's racial identity. Dr. Okonkwo explained the broader context that made these arrangements possible. Right after the Civil War, Virginia and other former Confederate states passed laws known as the Black Codes. These laws were designed to limit the freedom of newly freed people and push them into labor situations that were slavery in all but name. One cruel part allowed courts to apprentice black children to white employers, often their former enslavers, if the children were labeled orphans, abandoned, or without adequate means of support. What counted as adequate means was left to white judges, who often decided that black parents struggling to survive in the post-war economy were unfit to care for their children. But not all children were kept under legal orders. Some remained in white households through informal arrangements, verbal agreements, or simple pressure. A black mother working as a domestic might be told that if she wanted to keep her job, her child had to stay in the household too. The child could be shown to visitors as a ward, a companion, or, as in the Marsh photograph, something more ambiguous. The practice was common enough to have its own terms: yard children, house children, pet children, words that made it sound harmless while hiding its real cruelty. The hair is what makes this case especially disturbing, Dr. Okonkwo continued. Hair straightening for black children at that time was unusual and painful. Most methods used lye-based compounds that could burn the scalp if left on too long. For a child of 6 or 7 to go through that repeatedly just to make his hair appear straight would have been traumatic. It suggests the family was not simply keeping the child as a companion or servant. They were trying to change him. They were trying to erase who he was. Eleanor found herself returning to the photograph over and over, studying the boy's face for any hint of what he might have been feeling in that moment. His expression was hard to read. The long exposure times back then meant subjects had to stay still for several seconds, often leaving blank or tense looks. But there was something about the set of his mouth, a tightness that could have been discomfort, or something else entirely. Eleanor wondered if his scalp was still hurting from the chemicals used to flatten his hair. She wondered if he understood why he was dressed in velvet and posed beside this woman. She wondered if he remembered his mother and whether she had any choice in letting him go. The next step meant a trip to Richmond to visit the church where the Marsh family had been members. Eleanor traveled in early summer, driving down from the Shenandoah Valley to meet with the archivist at St. Paul's Episcopal Church, one of the oldest and wealthiest congregations in the city. The church stood prominently on Grace Street, its white steeple visible for blocks. During the Civil War, Jefferson Davis himself had worshipped here, and the pews still bore small brass plaques with the names of families who had purchased them generations ago. The Marsh name appeared on one in the third row from the front. The church kept detailed records of births, deaths, marriages, and baptisms going back to the 18th century. These records had a dual purpose before the Civil War. They documented the spiritual life of the white congregation, but they also sometimes noted baptisms of enslaved people owned by church members. These entries were brief, often missing surnames, recording only a first name, the owner's name, and the date. They were, in effect, property records disguised as religious documents. If Samuel had been baptized there, or if any official record existed of his relationship to Adelaide Marsh, it would be in those ledgers. The archivist, a retired teacher named Mrs. Dorothy Hale, was in it. Eerily skeptical of Eleanor's inquiry. The Marsh family were generous donors for generations, she said, leading Eleanor through a hallway lined with portraits of former rectors. I'm not sure what you hope to find that's historically significant, but when Eleanor showed her the photograph, Mrs. Hale's expression changed. She studied it for a long moment, then looked at Eleanor with what might have been recognition. I've seen this boy before, she said quietly. Not in person, of course, but there's another photograph in the collection. Mrs. Hale retrieved a second photograph from storage in the church basement. It showed the same boy, about 10 years older. He wore a plain dark suit, standing behind a seated group of white women at what seemed to be a church event. The women smiled, fanning themselves in the summer heat, their dresses light-colored and relaxed. Behind them, Samuel stood rigidly. His hair was short now, natural curls visible even in the faded image. He wasn't looking at the camera, he was looking down, hands clasped in front of him, standing perfectly still. There was no velvet, no lace collar, no tender lean into anyone's shoulder. The companion child had become something else. Eleanor studied both photographs side by side, trying to reconcile them. The boy in velvet and the servant in dark wool, the straightened hair painfully plastered to his scalp, and the natural curls of a teenager finally allowed to look like himself. The possessive embrace of the earlier portrait contrasted with the empty space between bodies in the later one. It was as if she were looking at two different people, yet the face was unmistakably the same eyes, same jawline. But his expression had hardened over the decade. Whatever softness had been present or performed in the earlier image was gone. In its place was something more guarded, watchful, aware of the era's gaze and what it could reveal. Church records confirmed what Eleanor had suspected. Samuel had never been legally adopted by Adelaide Marsh. He had never been baptized as her son. Instead, a single entry from 1876 noted the return of a colored ward named Samuel to his mother Celia, who had apparently remained in the Marsh household as a domestic servant throughout the years her son was displayed as Adelaide's companion. The entry was brief, almost bureaucratic, but its implications were devastating. For 6 years, Celia had watched her son dressed up and paraded as another woman's child. She had watched his hair be burned straight. She had watched him posed for portraits that erased her entirely. Finally, she had found a way to reclaim him. Dr. Okonkwo helped Eleanor locate records from a black church in Richmond, founded by formerly enslaved people in 1866. Known in its early years as the Colored Baptist Church of Richmond, it had been established in the basement of a former warehouse just months after the war ended. Its founding members had spent their lives in bondage, forbidden to read or write, denied the right to marry or keep their children. One of the first things they did with their freedom was create a place that recorded their existence in their own words. The church kept separate membership rolls from white congregations that refused black members full participation, or relegated them to segregated balconies. These rolls recorded marriages denied under slavery, births of children who would not be sold, deaths and memorialized lives. Sometimes they recorded reunions. In those records, Eleanor found Celia listed as a founding member, along with a note that she had been reunited with her son Samuel in 1876. The entry was short but deliberate. Reunited, not received, acquired, or any euphemism white record keepers might have used. Reunited implied a separation that was wrong, a bond that had existed before and was now restored. It showed Celia had always been Samuel's mother. Even during the years a white woman had dressed him in velvet and called him her son. Another entry from 1879 recorded Samuel's marriage to a woman named Hannah. A third from 1882 noted the birth of their first child, a daughter named Eleanor. The discovery that the boy in the photograph had survived, reclaimed his identity, and built a family beyond the Marsh household was both a relief and a challenge. It meant the story didn't end with erasure, but raised questions about how to tell it over a century later, with descendants of all involved still living. Eleanor brought her findings to the Historical Society's director, Richard Townsend, who had hired her years earlier and generally trusted her judgment. She laid out the photographs, the records, and her correspondence with Dr. Okonkwo, explaining what she believed the evidence showed. The 1870 portrait was not of a mother and son. It was a white woman and a black child kept as a companion, a living doll whose hair had been chemically straightened to appear more like her own child. The inscription on the back, Adelaide Marsh with son, was not a record of a biological relationship, but a claim of ownership disguised as affection. Townsend listened, studied the evidence, and then leaned back with a sigh. "This will be complicated," he said. The Marsh family were major donors for generations. Their descendants still sat on the board. Recontextualizing the photograph would upset some people. Eleanor replied, "They will be unhappy, but the descendants of Samuel and Celia have been invisible for 150 years, not the descendants of Adelaide Marsh." 3 weeks later, she presented her research to the board. She showed them the two photographs side by side, the velvet-clad companion child of 1870 and the servant of 1880. She explained the hair straightening, the missing census entries, and the church records documenting Celia's campaign to reclaim her son. She quoted Dr. Okonkwo's analysis of companion children and their role in post-emancipation racial control. The room was silent. Then a woman in the back, a Marsh descendant, spoke. "I don't understand what you want us to do with this. You're asking us to accuse my ancestors of kidnapping a child, based on a photograph and some church records?" "I'm not accusing anyone," Eleanor said carefully. "I'm asking us to tell the truth. For decades, this image has been displayed as a portrait of mother and son. That caption is wrong. The boy was not Adelaide Marsh's son. He was the son of Celia, who spent years trying to get him back. Displaying it with the old caption continues the same erasure that was done to Celia and Samuel in their own time." The debate went on for over an hour. Some board members said the evidence was circumstantial, that Eleanor was reading too much into old, unclear records. Others worried about the public reaction to correcting the story of a prominent local family. But a few, including a newer member who taught African American history at a local college, argued strongly that the society had a duty to tell accurate stories, even if they were uncomfortable. In the end, a compromise was made. The photograph would be redisplayed with a new, expanded caption, explaining the uncertainty of the relationship between the two subjects and giving context about companion children in the post-Civil War South. A small exhibition would feature both photographs and excerpts from the church records showing Samuel's return to his mother. The society would also try to contact any descendants of Samuel and Celia to involve them in telling the fuller story. Finding those descendants took 6 months. Eleanor worked with a genealogist, Marcus Webb, who specialized in tracing African American family lines, a painstaking task complicated by destroyed records and the frequent separation and scattering of black families. Webb explained that tracing Samuel's lineage meant working both backward and forward, using every surviving fragment, marriage licenses, death certificates, rare property records, school enrollment lists, fraternal organization memberships, and church records from multiple congregations, since families often moved for work or to escape violence. The search was also complicated by the Great Migration, when millions of black Americans moved from the rural South to northern and western cities in search of better wages, safety, and escape from Jim Crow laws. Descendants could be anywhere now. Webb traced Samuel's son through census records to Baltimore in 1910, then to Philadelphia by 1920. The T-rail grew clearer from there. Samuel's granddaughter had married a steelworker named Holland. Their children stayed in Philadelphia, and eventually Webb found a woman named Patricia Holland, living in Germantown, a retired nurse whose great-great-grandmother had been named Hannah. Her family Bible had an entry for Hannah's husband, Samuel, born in bondage, stolen as a child, returned to his mother by the grace of God. Patricia Holland came to Richmond for the exhibition opening. She stood in front of the 1870 photograph for a long time, silent, her hand pressed against the glass as if she could reach the boy inside. When she finally turned to Eleanor, she was crying but smiling. "My grandmother used to talk about him," she said. "She called him the stolen son. He never spoke about those years, but his mother, Celia, said the white woman dressed him like a doll and burned his hair to make him look like someone he wasn't. We thought it was just a story. We never knew there was a picture." The exhibition ran for 4 months and drew more visitors than any previous show at the Historical Society. Local newspapers covered it, and several academic journals published articles about companion children, using the Marsh photograph as a case study. Dr. Okonkwo gave a lecture to a full auditorium, explaining how Samuel's story fit a broader pattern of white families keeping control over black children through both legal and informal means after emancipation. She showed other photographs from Alabama, South Carolina, and Mississippi of well-dressed black children posed with white women who were not their mothers. The exhibition also led the Historical Society to review other items in its collection that had been catalogued decades ago with minimal documentation or misleading descriptions. They found photographs labeled family servant showing children too young to work. They found portraits of nurse in charge, where the supposed nurse was barely older than the infant she held. They found images of black people with no names, described only as domestic scene or household group. Each of these items was now being researched, contextualized, and, where possible, connected to descendants who might have their own stories to share. Richard Townsend, the director, who had worried about donors, told Eleanor the exhibition had changed his view of the society's mission. "We've been treating these photographs as artifacts," he said, "objects to preserve and display. But they aren't just objects, they're evidence. And for over a century, we've presented it in a way that supported one version of events while silencing another. I don't know how to undo all of that, but we have to start somewhere." For Eleanor, the most important moment came near the exhibition's end, when Patricia Holland returned with her daughter and 2 grandchildren. They stood before the photograph, 4 generations of Samuel's descendants, looking at the boy who had been erased and reclaimed, stolen and returned. The youngest grandchild, a girl about 7, the same age Samuel had been, pointed at the image and asked her great-great-great-grandmother who the people were. Patricia knelt beside her. "That's your great-great-great-great-grandmother's son," she said. "His name was Samuel. The woman next to him is not his mother. His real mother was Celia, who loved him so much she spent years fighting to get him back. And she did." The girl looked at the photograph again, then at Patricia. "Why is his hair like that?" she asked. Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Because they were trying to make him into something he wasn't," she said finally. "But it didn't work. He always knew who he was, and now we do too. Photographs lie. That is not new, but it matters every time we look at an old image and assume we understand it. The camera captures a moment, but that moment is always staged, framed, a performance of what the subjects and photographer wanted us to see. A white woman in silk posing with a black child in velvet, the tender lean of a small body into a maternal embrace. These are images that seem to show love and family, but the details tell a different story. The burned hairline, absence from the census, special ledger entries, the church record noting a return that should never have been needed. Samuel's photograph is not unique. Archives and attics across the country hold thousands of similar images, children dressed as companions, displayed to show benevolence while hiding violence. Hair straightened, skin lightened, identities erased to make abuse seem normal. Every one of those photographs is a crime scene, but also a record, if we know how to read it, of the people who survived. Samuel survived, Celia survived. Their descendants survived, carrying the story forward even when the photograph tried to erase it. The next time you look at an old portrait and feel a warm connection to the past, look closer. Look at the hands, the hair, the edges of the frame. Look for what doesn't belong. Look for the story the image isn't telling, because that story belongs to someone, and they have waited a very long time for someone to notice.